I wanted to open with this because it's really important. Representative Rashida Tlaib has led an effort to, well, she led this effort here, and a lot of other members of the squads signed it to get the DOJ to drop charges against Julian Assange. There were others in this letter. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez signed it. Greg Casar, who is a new kind of squad member from Texas. Jamaal Bowman, Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley, all of the usual good suspects, signed this letter to Attorney General Merrick Garland, who, you know, I always call him the ghost. You never see him. He really is not at the forefront of the Biden administration's plans. I wish, obviously, that the Democrats would take a page out of the Republicans' book and be a bit more aggressive when they hold power in the executive branch, but regardless, so who knows if he'll even read this, but they are asking him to drop charges against Julian Assange. Here's this letter. Let's put this up. Oh, the letter first. Rashida Tlaib says, 4 years ago today, Julian Assange was arrested for publishing the truth. I'm leading a letter to Attorney General Garland urging him to uphold the freedom of the press by dropping these Trump-era charges and withdrawing the extradition request. The letter says, Dear Attorney General Merrick Garland, we write to you today to call on you to uphold the First Amendment's protections for the freedom of the press by dropping the criminal charges against Australian publisher Julian Assange and withdrawing the American extradition request currently pending with the British government. Press freedom, civil liberty, and human rights groups have been emphatic that the charges against Mr. Assange pose a grave and unprecedented threat to everyday constitutionally protected journalistic activity, and that a conviction would represent a landmark setback for the First Amendment. She lists some media outlets that are asking for the withdrawal, ACLU, Amnesty International, and more. Let's go to the next page. The prosecution of Julian Assange for carrying out journalistic activities greatly diminishes America's credibility as a defender of these values, undermining the United States' moral standing on the world stage and effectively granting cover to authoritarian governments who can and do point to Assange's prosecution to reject evidence-based criticisms of their human rights records as a precedent that justifies the criminalization of reporting on their activities. Leaders of democracies, major international bodies, and parliamentarians around the globe stand opposed to the prosecution of Julian Assange. Former United Nations. So more and more people, Obrador, Lula, a bunch of other leaders who have said that this prosecution should stop. There is a global outcry, as she writes. And then just there's a bunch of citations. Here we go. Julian Assange faces 17 charges under the Espionage Act and 1 charge of conspiracy to commit computer intrusion. The Espionage Act's charges stem from Mr. Assange's role in publishing information about the U.S. State Department, Guantanamo Bay, and wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Much of this information was published by mainstream newspapers, such as the New York Times and Washington Post, who often worked with Mr. Assange and WikiLeaks directly in doing so. This is such a key point. Based on the legal logic of this indictment, any of those newspapers could be prosecuted for engaging in these reporting activities. In fact, because what Mr. Assange is accused of doing is legally indistinguishable from what papers like the New York Times do, the Obama administration rightfully declined to bring these charges. The Trump administration, which is, by the way, shocking given the Obama administration's absolute love for prosecuting people under the Espionage Act. The Trump administration, which brought these charges against Assange, was notably less concerned with press freedom. This is, by the way, good framing here because it appeals to the sensibilities of the Biden administration with that framing. But this final slide here, and then we'll just discuss. So here we go. Rashida Tlaib, Cori Bush, I should have mentioned her earlier, Greg Casar, Jamaal Bowman, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and others have signed this letter. So this is a really awesome thing to do here because there's no political value in it. You know, I was engaging with concepts of popularism yesterday and today on social media, and like, there are limits, and I actually think it's quite a limiting belief to say we're only going to do what's popular. We're only going to advocate what's popular as a party for electoral purposes. Well, we've talked on the show at length about the limits of electoralism, because it is shallow, flimsy, and it's not conducive to building long-lasting power in coalitions. What it also does, too, is it drastically limits the scope of what's possible and what you can advocate for on the left. Martin Luther King had a 75% disapproval rating the year he was killed in 1968. By the standards of popularism, the civil rights movement should not have happened because it wasn't too popular at the time. Gay marriage, not popular at the time when it was being advocated for initially, and people were trying to fight for those rights. And then that went up and up and up until, you know, Democratic politicians, notably Biden, I guess on the Ellen show, started advocating for it. But the activist groups did the work of making that position popular. And Julian Assange, not the most popular guy in Washington, not the most popular guy if you were to ask people who even know of him in the United States, which I would guess is not the majority. He was DMing with Don Jr. and doing other things that people might consider shady. And obviously there have been allegations against him that are problematic. I don't particularly care because that's not relevant to what we're talking about here. What WikiLeaks uncovered was war crimes by the United States. The most infamous, and Chelsea Manning went to prison over this. The most infamous was the nearly 40-minute video of a U.S. Apache helicopter raining bullets down in Iraq, killing just dozens of people for fun, laughing as they did it, including 2 Reuters journalists. That's a war crime by any definition of the word. And we're going after the guy that helped disseminate that information publicly. And there was more stuff. It was the images of torture. It was information about friendly fire in these wars of aggression by the United States. It was about the United States' relationship with other leaders in Afghanistan and the Taliban and their kind of shady dealings behind the scenes in order to maintain the occupation and war there, which we all know went on for way too long. So, like, the value of this information when the U.S. empire was engaged in such indefensible acts abroad, killing God knows how many people. I mean, hundreds of thousands in Iraq. I mean, hundreds of thousands in Afghanistan. We don't know the full scope. The fact that we have this information is incredibly valuable. And thankfully, Chelsea Manning has been released after being placed multiple times in solitary confinement and tortured, essentially, for daring to blow the whistle on the war crimes committed by the United States. And that letter is correct. What Julian Assange did is indistinguishable from what the Times or the Washington Post do or should be doing. The problem is that they are not at the forefront of these things. They're afraid about this kind of exposure, but prosecuting WikiLeaks for these crimes, or crimes in quotes, does, as they say, open up more legacy outlets for prosecution. And we've done this dance since the war on terror started. We're not going to put legal guardrails in place when Democrats get into office, when Obama or Biden get elected, because they want the option to use the powers of the war on terror for their own ends. But the problem with doing that is that it ensures that a guy like Trump can come in and use basically Obama's own logic under the Espionage Act for his own purposes and go after Julian Assange and have unlimited power in that area. So this is the right thing to do. I'm thrilled to see progressive members of Congress take up this mantle, and good on them. Glad to see it. And clearly the charges against Julian Assange should be dropped.